We're going to get going now with the second panel of the day. So this time we're going to be exploring questions about what it means to be operating as artists and arts organisations in spaces that are on the edge, but more in terms of socially, societally, economically. And as we did before, I'm going to start with some short responses from our panellists, ask them to reflect on their kind of experiences, perspectives, insights from their own work. So we've got 4 brilliant people here, actually some of the most inspiring people that I know, and who I feel exceptionally lucky to have got to know all of you really in the last 2 or 3 years. These are some of the people who make me at least feel a little bit less alone, a little bit less on the edge, sometimes pushing me over the edge, but they are all people who make me feel like we are kind of all in it together in our different contexts, somehow all in the same fight, even though we're from different parts of the country and operating in different ways. So first up, far left, Seth Scaife-Smith. So Seth is one of the directors of an absolutely brilliant organisation called Resolve Collective. Officially, I've got it down here, a UK-based interdisciplinary, just to make it hard, design practice who combine architecture, engineering, technology, arts, all seeking to address social challenges and to realise a kind of more just, equitable vision of change. They organise for resilience and work in communities and do lots of work with communities mainly in, I think, Croydon, southeast London area, but those who are kind of underrepresented, and I'm sure we'll hear from Seth about that. So then next to Seth, Amara Spence, who's driven 19 hours from Birmingham. Shouldn't take that long, but somehow did. Sorry. Amara is the founding director of Maya, a Black-led organisation that engages culture as imagination and as a kind of organising strategy for liberation. Maya are in the process of incubating a new organisation, Hood Commons, which I just sound like an idiot saying, designed to steward land out of private hands, a little like we've done here, but into a kind of reparative dignifying form of community stewardship. And as well as this, Amara is a curator and a convener and an artist in her own right. Thirdly then, local artist Lynn Barlow, who many of you know from her brilliant exhibition here the year before last, actually, already, where she unequivocally upstaged Grayson Perry with her really touching, powerful, beautiful quilts. So Lynn's work is personal, but it's also really political, grounded in her formative experiences in care, as a runaway to Brixton, as an activist at Greenham Common, and now continued in her work here as part of the kind of ever-growing craftivist movement. And then finally, on my left, to introduce Rabab Ghazul, not quite. Sorry. So Rabab is a socially engaged visual artist, curator, community activist, and founder and director of Gentle Radical. Gentle Radical is an arts organisation working primarily in Cardiff, doing very deep, hyper-local community work in the communities there. And she explores listening and talking as ways of practice, connecting and building relationships in those communities and to try and develop strength through and over difficult times. So that's our amazing panel. I'm going to start with you, Seth. I think we can... I'm afraid we haven't got the radio mics working again, so we'd have to do this slightly annoying, handing them back. But just let you introduce yourself and share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for hosting us as well today. Everyone's been so nice, I think, which is such a kind of warming feeling. So it's made this experience really beautiful. So just to give like a very brief introduction maybe to us and who we are as a practice and how that relates to this concept about the edge. Disclaimer, I am from London, and don't boo me, don't throw the tomatoes. But in a conversation around the edge, I think it's important to recognise that London is not an edge. It's the kind of beating heart of this like toxic system that we're all living through. it does create cracks, and I think that we have emerged within a particular crack. But just to kind of preface that, the condition that we describe is also in an environment of affluence in comparison to a lot of other places. It's important to recognise that. So we started in 2016. I practiced with my brother and a close friend of ours as well. And the condition that created us was that particular wave of gentrification in Brixton. So what you would find is that within these schemes of development, you'd find a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of buildings that were kind of in this stasis. They were waiting for a plan that was never going to happen, or that has never happened. And that created an opportunity for people like ourselves who were interested in, Jess gave it the very long spiel, which I'm glad she did, so I didn't have to. But we were interested in just creating spaces, making spaces for the communities that we look to serve, particularly those who are coming from marginalised backgrounds, particularly those who want to think about how they can positively impact their place. What that then looks like is building installations in in spaces that have been left abandoned for quite a while, allowing people to program it. And this was very much trying to support and work with generations who have come before us, because we also are a part of a kind of very historicized place. So it's recognizing that, but then also supporting people who are coming around the same time. So we did all of that. We practiced together. We shared a lot of joy and a lot of pain together. And then as a practice, we decided to think about how we could develop our tools, and we got some really amazing opportunities to work elsewhere outside of London. And I'm glad there was a person in the first panel who raised this point around how localities can become suffocating, and that is definitely something that's felt in contexts like Brixton, but also London. And I'm sure a lot of people can find that a familiar thing. And I think you can grow this intensity with a place that sometimes you need to break yourself free from it to be able to learn and then bring yourself back to it. So we were very, very fortunate, and we started to work across the country and across other places in the world, but with this thing that we call like translocality. So just being able to understand and recognize the importance of local practice in other spaces. When I talk about local practice, I'm thinking about the scale at which we work and the scale at which we can understand impact. I don't understand, and I can't really compute impact on a kind of massive multiplying scale. It's the relationships with local people. It's those relationships that are tangible and that are proximate to our experiences that we work within. So we moved across the country. One of the places that we were lucky enough to go was Birmingham, with my right honourable here. And actually it kind of seems like counterintuitive, but we had to go to Birmingham to get our aspirations really raised, right? Which not many people will say. But shout out Birmingham. And it was then that we started to think about how our practice could receive some of that knowledge and some of the dreams that people were having all over the country, which is why I'm really humbled to be here as well. Our practice then kind of grew these two tentacles. So we were thinking about how we continue to work in other places like Birmingham, Sheffield, hopefully places like Watchet as well. And also then, what can we do in our own community? What can we start to build in our own community? What kind of spaces are important for the places in the context that we navigate? And now we're in this interesting moment where we are doing both at the same time. So we're trying to kind of deepen our roots and strengthen our connections with the place that we work, which is in Croydon, which funnily enough is where I went to school. If anyone's been to Croydon, I do apologise, because it is a place that dreams go to die. It's a place that we have everything that you would have in like a kind of horror story. We have medieval landlords, we have failed development schemes, we have bankrupt councils, we have literally everything. We've got vacant towers next to new build towers. It's just like it's chaos, but it's also kind of ripe for a kind of radical imagination and I think a creative capacity that we're interested in bringing forward. So that's kind of us.
Yeah.
It's funny because you also painted Croydon like Mordor, and as I was driving like on my way here, I was just thinking about. So I live in Birmingham. Thank you. I live in Birmingham, and I'll talk about the Black Country region a bit more probably later on. But I was remembering that there's this kind of long-standing myth, and I don't know how true it is, that the Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of parts of the Black Country, particularly Dudley, if anybody knows the West Midlands, that was like the source material for Mordor. So that was really, thank you for bringing that up for me again. I live in the sexiest place on earth. 100% Birmingham. I love it. I hate it. All the contradictions. Contradictions is probably like the thing that I would talk about most over our time together. I am an artist, and I've always struggled with that idea. I've struggled with the kind of identity basedness of what it is to be an artist. I've never been interested in the art world, or the kind of extractive economy of the art world, and how our creativity is exploited to serve that world. Never been into it myself, and that has never been the direction of what I long for. And I was thinking on my way here about creative practice more broadly, and how this is something that I'm really interested and excited by. And I was thinking a lot about what it is to be the granddaughter of my grandfather, who at any given moment I'm very excited to speak about. My grandfather moved in 1960 from the Caribbean to the Black Country, a tiny hamlet of a place called Wednesbury, which is not far from Dudley, not far from Mordor. Very similar history, this sort of post World War II housing estate, very typical kind of like council estate and housing, former industrial town. So when industry declines, so does people's prospects, so does people's hope, so do people's vision, so do people's community, and real resources. And my granddad landed in this place that was a very a predominantly white working class town, and I always say somehow he built this oasis that was in the shape of a 2 up 2 down terraced house, which was really centered in love. Like, we just, he took care of people took care of him, he looked after everybody's kids. His living room was like a museum, like for everybody's children are on the walls, and we don't know who half of these kids are, and there's plastic on the remember those old plastic runners in the hallway that kind of like makes funny sounds when you step on it, and there's a glass cabinet, everything is pristine in this room, right? And it was really a living testament, I think, to love. Like, how do you preserve what it is that you actually care about? That's what his living room was. And then, well, that's the front room, then there's the real living room in the back, that there's more furniture than what can actually fit in it. There's more people in it than that can actually fit in it, and like there's tables on top of couches, and somehow your nan's in the corner. I mean, my granddad's house was chaos, but it was full of love. And when I think about the kind of economy of his house, it was really love that sustained it in many ways, right? And it was you didn't have to be a relative to experience that economy, right? It was genuinely communal, and the kind of continuation of the cooperative, the collective economics that led to his survival in this country. And I look at all the work that we've been doing as a kind of continuation of that spirit. How do we build that spirit in this time that is trying to disconnect us from each other so much, that is trying to disconnect us from the belief that together we are much stronger than as individual entities, because the individual is still put as the kind of the direction of where our focus should be. And so the idea of now building things, I'm always sitting in the contradiction of what that is as an artist who is disillusioned by the art world to want to build other things. And then on my way here, I was really thinking about enterprise, and enterprise not as this kind of technology of capitalism, but enterprise a creative practice as a way to say, as poor as working class people, we know what it is to not be cared for by the state, to not be seen or understood or valued by certain systems, but to understand that with our creativity we can find these openings. And I think about I think about a brother who, when I was in Jamaica, and I came out of the airport, and there was this brother who was like, do you need a lift do you need a lift or do you want me to drive somewhere? He's not a taxi driver at all, but he's genuinely noticed like there's a gap here, and he formed his own kind of business in supporting people to get from where they need to be. And I think about that as an act of radical imagination. How do you survive engaging with whatever you have, wherever you are, and utilize that to support someone else? So it's amazing to hear my brother speaking about the mill from that very, very humble perspective of, I have a craft, there's a thing that I do and I want to continue it. I'm just interested in how do we sustain that culture that I really think is about love.
Thank you.
Hi, I don't know how I follow that. If Birmingham's Mordor, I'm not quite sure where Sheffield sits. I couldn't wait to escape Sheffield, but I've realised in later life that you carry it with you. It's your roots, it's the place, you know. So now I'm an artist. I don't know if I call myself an artist really. In an environment that has been incredibly nurturing, and I'm losing it. Give me a prompt.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got from Sheffield to here?
Right, yeah. Sheffield was a difficult place for me, and I couldn't wait to escape it. And my first real escape took me to Brixton in London as a young runaway child. And I think that first experience of being part of a community was in Brixton. I spent much of my childhood in care. I was a bit of a rebel. And I think I realised back then that I needed a form of articulation. But back then I found art quite scary, still do find art quite scary. So my form of articulation was to rebel, really. So I became kind of a sort of reluctant rebel, but that was what drew me. So years later, I got involved in the peace movement and saw masses of amazing creative women, but still I felt I didn't really have the skills to articulate. So post Greenham, I worked for a while as a researcher for a magazine, then went back into higher education, and to cut a long story short, I moved to Somerset. And then in 2015, I remember it well because it was around the time of Brexit, and I lost a dear friend and I couldn't get to her funeral, so I thought, well, I really want to send something up there. So I picked up a piece of material, started playing around, and that was what became the entirety of my life almost. I discovered that I could create and articulate through a medium of sewing and textile art. And I think, I don't know, Eastquay gave me an opportunity like no other, really, which was to create something that meant so much to me, and a way of communicating and raising awareness and interacting with the environment and like on a personalist political level.
Thank
that right?
How do I follow that? I am at an edge speaking in public all the time. This is like and trying to articulate what it is I want to say. Because when I've been thinking about edges, thousands of edges splinter out in my head, and they all feel like important edges to try and address. And the only way I can try and be succinct in 5 minutes is I just thought of some quotes that are dear to me. I'm going to try and hook some things on those. And probably just briefly, my work as a socially engaged artist historically has probably been about not being comfortable in the spaces I found myself in, or in the kind of regimes of working, like the classic being parachuted into a community, and then the levels of extraction and commoditization that go with what we do to communities, what we do to literally people, sat so uncomfortably with me that I kind of ended up setting up an arts organisation in the hope that we could do differently. And that has all of its own complex histories, because how do you escape systems that are fundamentally colonial and extractive all the time? Like, where is the escape route? I don't know if there is an escape route, but there is choices that we make. But actually, I was thinking of Tony Cade Bambara, and that amazing quote, no longer alive, but African-American writer, activist, artist, filmmaker. And she said, you know, the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And from the perspective of edges, what I think I understand by that is the project is revolution. The project is dismantling systems. The function of the artist is to say, this is the project. Like it's the project to get on board with. And that's what creativity does. It makes it vital and potent. It makes liberatory and revolutionary work vital and potent and sort of attractive, right? But I believe that revolutionary work is our birthright. It's all of our work. So that's one way of seeing what, like, I think the role of the artist is. And what I love about that quote, it actually says what seems like edge work, revolutionary work, change work is really in the center for all of us. So kind of one of my questions is, how do we bring this work into the center? And then I was thinking about, for some of us, this text is a bit like a Bible, Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, which is like one I constantly go back to. And they say, you know, art is not neutral. It either upholds or disrupts the status quo, advancing or regressing justice. And I really find it hard to get that out of my head. So one of the edges within context of quotes like that for me is like, I don't sometimes know, and I'm feeling this increasingly as I get older, if I even need to be in an art world or in a cultural sector. I'm not sure if I care anymore. What I really care about is building relational wealth. What I really care about is that relationship is centered. And we are living through like the violence of a neoliberal project, which is now so deep, so the wounds are so overwhelming, and I'm aware that we're sitting in a rarefied space. My life is a rarefied space. Do you know what I mean? Like, even to be able to say that, you know, the level of privilege to be able to name that. What does it mean to kind of build back, to do the work of repair? That is about valuing the dignity of life itself, valuing the relational. And There's a quote here. I'm a little bit at an edge, sorry, the pun, to kind of share it because I really love these writers. Sometimes I don't actually always understand what they're saying, and I feel I'm going to be a bit pretentious reading it out, but I'm going to try to be as sincere as I can. They're called the Invisible Committee. They're like French kind of anarchist kind of academics, and they are invisible because I think the way they write and what they address means they want to be anonymous sometimes. But this was about the economic question. You said, how are we on the peripheries, marginal to certain economic spaces? And that made me think about the fact that the whole art world, a part of, like, when I talk about, the institutions of the art world and the establishment of the contemporary art world is like so rammed up the backside of like the worst excesses of the capitalism, basically. Like, so there are no edges there. There's real right in the heart of, excuse my language, that was a bit intense. I just wanted to read this and see if I understand it, see if anyone else, see if we can. So basically they say the genius, do they say that? And then I'll finish. The genius of the economic operation is to conceal the plane on which it commits its misdeeds, the one on which it conducts its veritable war, the plane of bonds. In this way, it confounds its potential adversaries and is able to present itself as totally positive, whereas it is quite evidently motivated by a fierce appetite for destruction, like the framework of economics. It has to be said that the bonds readily lend themselves to this. What is more immaterial, subtle, intangible than a bond? What's less visible, less opposable, but more sensitive than a bond that's been destroyed? And this is the bit that really speaks to my heart. The contemporary numbing of sensibilities, their systematic fragmentation, is not just the result of survival within capitalism, it's the precondition for survival. We don't suffer from being individuals, we suffer from trying to be that. Since the individual entity exists fictitiously only from the outside, being an individual requires remaining outside oneself, strangers to ourselves, foregoing any contact with oneself as well as with the world and others. Sorry if that's a little bit, I don't even know if I quite grasp everything it says there. I think it's the piece about, I don't care really where I am, like on what edges I'm in or on, but I believe the collective edge is to dismantle these systems, and I believe it's through relationship, through radical relationship, through love and through care, and to rebuild these bonds, basically. That is the deepest dream and in my heart, really. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, well, wish me luck marshalling all of these. I'm gonna where to start. There's so much to unpack. I think maybe we can start a bit by unpicking this question. I think that both Seth and Amara kind of raised about working in these radical spaces with people whose voices are not represented or not heard, and trying to kind of build that out in some way. And I guess the thing I was thinking when you were both talking about it, maybe it's the contradictions bit, is like you're working in these spaces which are kind of radical and are you're occupying a space that is like you're not meant to occupy or something, maybe. But I wonder whether you feel like you've chosen to occupy that space, like that's where you took up your room, or whether you've been like put there. Like, do you know what I mean? And like, do you want out to be in a more central space? Like, we all think. Do you know what I mean? It's like, are you in there because you've chosen it and that's your decision to be there on the edge? Or is it that that's the only place you were allowed? And what's the journey then? Are we trying to get to the centre? Like, I'm not sure we are. Like, I like it out here on the edge, and I think I might hate me if I was in the centre. So like, then the contradiction there, perhaps you can, try and say something a bit about that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think, like spiritually and ideologically, I feel, and I was talking to Rabab about this before, that I do feel like it's where I'm meant to be because of the generations that have come before me, what my family have done previously, and some of the things that they've entrenched in me and my brother, which I'm very thankful for. But I think that you are right. Like there is a contradiction, a bit of a contestation with how you occupy space and where you occupy space, and your agency over where you are and how you act. But we quite like it in The Edge. I don't think that the idea is to get to the centre. Actually, I think that you have to be able to recognise your own contradictions. You have to be able to recognise your own positionality as well. Like I'm very conscious that we, as a practice, do things in a certain way. We occupy a particular space, but that's not everyone's realm. We have worked with a lot of like quote unquote galleries and institutions and creative institutions, some that we found very problematic, but we have been doing that work because I think we saw that there was a particular opening in the moment that we were coming up, and we took it, and we kind of decided that was going to be a way that we could test ideas, share knowledge, and try and create disruptions in that particular space. And an example of that is like the more and more we've been recognized in gallery spaces, the more and more the work that we do looks less like it should be there, and the more we've been pushed out of there. And I think now we find ourselves in a really lovely space, which is that I think they're glad to see the back of us and we're glad to see the back of them. And I think that we're strategizing about ways that we can work in that kind of cultural space, using the knowledge that we've acquired, using the understanding that we've acquired, but distributing resources and creating mechanisms that we can start to move resources to the communities that we support in a much more long-term way. That's the thing that we are most passionate about. Be that creating infrastructures that can support and nurture artists and creative communities, or infrastructures that can move material to local communities and start to think about those as spaces for kind of collective understanding and growth. So it's kind of recognizing that the contradiction and the contestation that comes within that position, and being kind of fluid and comfortable with the idea that things can move, things can shake, but you just got to recognize where you are and what you've been given and blessed with.
There's a couple of ways that I'm thinking about this question, and I guess the first is to say, so I am an artist. I'm predominantly a performance artist, so I work a lot with sound, with my body, with music, in theatre and non-theatre spaces, and I never wanted to start an organisation. So I'll start there, and the reason that I didn't was because I knew that my practice is in service of liberation, and I do not believe that the organizational form, with all of its requirements and logics and the system that it is centered in, is conducive to liberation. So contradiction on day one of setting up an organization is, I'm in the thick of that tension, and it's an ongoing tension. And I also acknowledge the utility of the organization as a form, and that's where I kind of draw on these kinds of the lineages of fugitivity and this idea of when I say this, I think so much about Harriet Tubman, who, if you're not familiar with Harriet Tubman, please look into her, do some Googles. But Harriet Tubman was a badass ancestor who who basically coordinated a network of safe houses. As a formerly enslaved person, they made their own escape path and then kept going back to the plantation to free other people. That's a really crass, short version of the richness of her life. But when I talk about the fugitive, in the first instance, there's an acknowledgement of there is a thing that we need to escape from. There is a thing that is detrimental to our lives and the possibility of us, and an escape which is literally a matter of life or death. So the stakes are insurmountable, but the commitment is holding really rigid to, one, there's a possibility of our life and of generations to come that are beyond this plantation. First, that vision and that faith in order to make the commitment to move is one thing. To then acknowledge that your liberation is bound with the liberation of other people keeps you in the fight to then not just free yourself, but to return multiple times to ensure that there are structural conditions in place that support the freedom of all people. So when I think about this kind of fugitive way of being, I also understood that there is a utility in the organizational form. We can kind of like hack and subvert some stuff and, you know, do a bit of this, don't tell nobody, oh my gosh, it's recording, oh my God. But also, you know, I come from a long line of people who know how to do this, and they don't call themselves artists. They're just working class folks trying to survive a system that is actually trying to kill us in a lot of ways. And I don't mean that passively. I mean the system that is literally, you know, trying to kill us or massively suppress our lives and our liveliness. And I think a lot about hip hop in this regard. So I'm a massive hip hop fan, like so bad. If anyone wants to talk afterwards and just geek out about tracks, I feel like we've got some history here. But when I think about hip hop, I think so much about the conditions that necessitated the birth of hip hop was very much tied to the physical location of it. So the projects, the housing estates in New York City, alongside many other things, because, you know, no place is fixed in time or geography, but hip hop was birthed in the projects as a critique to its physical environment, right? Don't push me, 'cause I'm close to that song, yeah? The Edge, oh my God. Oh my God. Whoa. Yeah, it was, no? Oh my God, that's so good. That song, if you listen to the lyrics of that song is talking about a not so beautiful housing project, right? A housing estate, right? And it's describing the conditions. And I love the fact that an art form could be a response to its physical environment. So why I really looked at the idea of creative practice, if we can resist, if we can fight, if we can be anti what is around us, how can we be pro? How do we express what it is that we long for, not just what we're fighting against? How do we build the thing, and how do we do it in our language, in our spirit, in our faith, in our possibility that something more than what we're in is not just possible, but it's plausible? So then can I just make one like really quick example of like I have a live contradiction with starting a business and all this kind of stuff. I'm an artist. I know nothing about accounts, right? I know nothing about accounts. I hate Excel spreadsheets. All of it, I don't know what any of this means, and you have to work out so much along the way. And for years, I was working this out on the go, made a lot of mistakes, got some hefty fines, the whole shebang. And then there was I think it was 2022, the contradiction of trying to really account for what it is that we care about and not just account for zeros and ones became overwhelming. I don't want to talk about the value of the work that we do in relation to a balance sheet where that only acknowledges income and expenditure, profit and loss. Like that's very, it's boring if nothing else. It's really reductive to the richness of our work. So I took that as a live contradiction. How could we align our accounting system, the things that we do, with what it is that we care about? The long story cut short is I like to make residencies for myself out of things that I'm struggling with. And so I made a residency that was, how would I define this accounting system in the spirit of the Black imagination? How do we reconcile with the incredible ingenuity of Black artistry with this systemic challenge? So we made a residency, invited like loads of artists. A wonderful collaborator, Andre Anderson, came down, and we decided that we were going to make our own language. We were going to call it graph, and that language was going to be how we account for the tangible as well as the intangible things of our work. So sometimes we might have to report how many people came to the event, but if that's all we can talk about, and we can't also talk about, well, where was love present in the room, you know, or we might have to measure our carbon emissions. That's fine if we want to look at a carbon kind of tunnel, but also how can we think about our more than human accountabilities, and where do we get to express that kind of accounting for? So we made this language that was like very multidisciplinary in approach, and it ended up with, I ended up making an album that was our annual accounts, and and we actually submitted those accounts, that album, to one of our funders. But they didn't tell us that they came to the exhibition that we had about it, and they were like, this is amazing. Can you teach us how to graph so that we can share it with our other grantees? And you can also do this for your reporting from here on out. So I'm saying that because also the constraints on this system likes to tell us that, oh, we can't, or it's too much, or it's too, I guess we have to break all the rules, man. If it's not about harming people, you know, break all of the rules. What's the worst that can happen? That's a really bad.
That's a great place to hand over. I'm going to get you to hand the mic over to a consummate rule breaker. And I think lots of the things that you're saying probably really resonate with Lynn, and this kind of creating your own path, being on the outskirts, being a bit of a fugitive, like not following the rules, finding a different way around. And I know that in lots of senses, Lynn, you've kind of had these experiences where in like some version of it, you're kind of an outsider, right? You're in the care system or as an activist or in prison or all these things, which is like the outsider. But the thing that's always struck me about the conversations we've had is that actually in those spaces is where you've always found like community, home, belonging, people, like your tribe. And so I just wanted to kind of pick that up a bit with you. Like, is that how it felt to you, or am I like post-rationalizing your experience?
No, I agree with that. I think for me there's always been this feeling of being the other. And you look at the world at the moment, and it's full of people who are being pigeonholed, or we're scared of anything that is different, that is other. And I think as artists, it's kind of our responsibility to challenge that perspective. For all the fractured, marginalised, it's.
And that's where you found your kind of peace, or I don't know, peace is probably a stretch, but like found your community within those spaces.
Yeah. I think art is a particularly cathartic kind of interaction, where you can actually celebrate otherness or difference or whatever. And I think at the moment, the way the world is, it's vitally important that we carry on doing that. And I think spaces like East Quay give an opportunity to build on that.
Thank you. I wanted to also pick up, perhaps with you, Rabab, I think it's really interesting what you're talking about, the bonds. I mean, I kind of understood some of it, right? I got some of the quote. Maybe between us all, we got most of it. But we talk here a lot about attachments, and that kind of attachment to people, to each other, to place, to history, to the future, to the land, as these kind of antidote to the ravages of capitalism. And it is literally a system which is built on getting rid of that stuff, like don't have those attachments, don't remember your kin, don't look forward or back, like get rid of all that, individualize you. So that, I mean, that really resonates with me. And I think it's an interesting challenge, like whether we should be doing this in a cultural way or not. But I guess what I wanted to unpick a bit is about if the response, if the answer in some way is the building of the relationships, like how are you doing that in like a really hyper-local way? How are you, what's the actual practice there? Because I think that we struggle with that here. Like we think that's what we're doing, but actually what does that mean? Like what's the actual practice?
Yeah, I mean, we think we're doing it as well. Like it's like, you know, you can want to do the thing and then you come up against all the things that make the thing hard. But I suppose one of the most one of the things that we decided to do a few years ago is to kind of rethink this model of outreach. So most cultural engagement work is based on this model of we go out, we got to get people in. I mean, if I'm really crude, the bums on seats, the participants, whatever. And then outreach is something that we do right at the beginning of the project, and then like it just disappears. And so I suppose we thought, what would happen if outreach was permanent? If conversations were the permanent materiality of the work. So if you think of like, okay, we work in multidisciplinary ways and we can think of all the different mediums and that materialities, and of course that we work with, and then of course we bring in other artists and they work with all their disciplines. But what if the primary discipline is conversation? And what if there's no end to that? Now I say, what if there's no end? Resource and capacity and all of those things actually do mean there are finite frameworks to that sometimes. But aspirationally, what if outreach is just an ongoing process? What if conversation is an ongoing process? Which I think when you focus on a hyperlocal neighborhood, we have 51 streets, 2,400 households, 13,000 people, you know. Of course, we haven't got through any, you know, all of those people, clearly all those households. But what we started doing is, as a team, actually doing doorstepping and door knocking and literally meeting people. So there's several things to that are key. One, as a team. So historically, not that anyone has any money anymore to have an access officer or an outreach, you know, or an engagement officer. Those things are long gone. But actually what does happen within those roles is that you often have in organizations or you know, institutions, one person is building relationships, and if they leave, they take all of those relationships with them. And so like I've always had a real issue with like institutions, sort of the hierarchy of cultural institutions is that the people who are lowest down in that hierarchy have the closest connection to people. And it's like, seems so screwed up, because the people at the top need to have those connections to be able to actually ascertain what creative strategy needs to look like, what, you know, leadership needs to look like, what your programming needs to look like. So one of the things in our relatively small team, which has fluctuated, but I suppose had maybe at most 8 or 9 very part-timers, you know, at the most, and then come in and out of that, is we would go on like entire team outreaching days, you know. So we're having those conversations together, we're door knocking together. So it doesn't matter what role you are in the organization, everyone is actually engaged in that relational kind of process, and then it really informs radically what we're going to do or how we're going to do it. And also then you can't just door knock and meet someone, because particularly in the community, in the neighborhood where we live, the kind of intersecting kind of set of social harms that are just impacting people all the time means that actually you might door knock and be on someone's doorstep for 25 minutes because they've not spoken to anyone for 3 weeks, and they're not in a good space, or they're super angry, or they're ranting about X or Y, and there's every legitimate reason. And it might be that you have to go back the third or the fourth or the fifth time, because actually they're not going to rock up to your community film night, even if it's free ticketed and free food, because they're not actually in a space where that's even a priority. So how do conversations sustain? Are they held by a wider group of people? How are they not hierarchical? How is that work centered as really profound work to power how an organization functions, as opposed to something that happens over here by an individual on the sidelines?
Yeah, I mean, I really hear all of those things. I think the bit that, and I'd be interested to see whether you guys struggle with the same, probably in everyone's roles, is there's this balance between having those conversations, having a thin enough skin to like really care and engage with those conversations, but also somehow staying safe, if that's the right word, which it isn't, but you know what I mean? Like, if we're giving our work to having those conversations and making those connections, then what comes with connections is sometimes painful, messy, grubby, offensive. Like there's a lot of things that are difficult in all of that. And how do you kind of, it's another contradiction, right? Like, how do you balance that? That's another edge. How do you balance on that edge, I guess?
Well, I mean, really briefly, I suppose a couple of years ago, we did a year and a half of work with an amazing, I mean really amazing, as in a genuinely radical mental health charity called Platform in Welsh, like double F Platform, if you're looking them up. To really understand trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed work. Our team, gosh, when was this? Maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, did some work with an amazing woman who's actually since passed in the last few months, in her 70s. She was Micheline Mason, who's been working around listening circles for 20 years. So actually, we all started training in, like, what does it mean to just hold space? Just like the baseline is, before someone might want to, like, might even have the wherewithal to get to an event or participate in something you're doing, if that person hasn't been heard or witnessed or listened to or hasn't had a conversation with anyone for 2 months, like, where are they at? What other provision is there before, we're doing this great project. Yeah, am I heating the house tonight? Am I eating? You know, it's for some people, it is that level of choice. So I think what it's made us think about is, what are the other mechanisms that are relational, that don't have to come out of some kind of creative, strategic offer, you know, creatively or culturally, but that can be continuing as a baseline for people who want to come in and go. And those listening circles are open to anyone. And they often come out of those door knocking and on the doorstep, and that offer is made. And some people might want to come to that before turning up to a cultural offering.
And I think it's this stuff that's like why arts cultural organizations are also like, this is also a serious economic social question, right? Because you're having those conversations, people are not having like nice conversations about watercolor paintings. Like, this is like real serious life stuff. And so you can't be, maybe you can, but I certainly can't be a cultural operator organization that's just doing culture and not actually also doing quite radical economics and quite serious challenging to what's going on in the state and what's being provided societally. Because you're stepping, every time you're having those conversations, you're stepping into those other spaces where like things are a mess and someone needs to act. You're nodding at me, Amara. Give her the mic.
Because it's also like, I think this is one of the misconceptions that I find, is like, culture is seen as this thing that's over there, as opposed to fundamentally that's what culture is. It is the tools, the behaviors, the artifacts, the stories, the values, the beliefs, the principles that are shared. And currently, and to refer back to our sibling in my head, Adrienne Maree Brown, there's this idea, what was I even going to say now? I'm just thinking about Adrienne Maree Brown. There is this feeling we are living inside the imagination and the culture that is harming us, right? It's somebody else's imagination, somebody else's culture that we have normalized. I'm massively paraphrasing, but we have normalized, and we all exist within it. And I think that reimagining the role of art in this shifting of culture is like, art is one of the capacity builders to say, what is the culture that we actually long for? Like, what are the actual principles that we want to refound our belief system on? How do we actually want to like rebuild our communities? And then how is the art in service of that? And then the dialogue is a facilitator of that new culture. And we think about even the idea of our cultural program. we only think about it really in terms of it's an invitation to be in dialogue. Like it's just a way into relationship. And I think we were talking about this earlier, and one thing that I think we all share, and probably most of us in this room, I think that culture in the kind of neoliberal imagination, as we're saying, is like void of, or trying to like void of connection, communication, relationship. But what I believe and what I think a lot of us share is we can't keep acting like we can bypass the hard work of relationship. The relationship is the only way. Relationship is not a romantic, utopianized, like, you know, it's not a story of romance. It is really hard work. And that's what we've signed up for. And why I think I draw back to my hood, I draw back to like my neighborhood to really understand we are well versed at doing the hard relationshiping work. And it's not recognized by the city at large. I live in a really difficult and disparate and very divergent neighborhood. It's like a story of many parts. But one thing that I love is, I always say this, like, I think we make these romantic notions of like what it is to care as though it's like perfect. This like really, really sanitized version of care, right? That is easy, and if we just do this and if we just do that, it will all be wonderful. But what I understand and what my elders teach me is sometimes I might be tripping and they might need to pull me up by the scruff of my neck, and that might also be a really loving, caring act that they do because they know me and they see me and they can see I'm tripping, for example. That I think is love in practice. It can also be really hard, and we need that for each other. So I think moving away from these really romantic ideas of what care is and really grounding in the tough, like, you might need to tell me about myself and I might need to tell you about yourself, and then we're going to roll up our sleeves and get back into it tomorrow, you know. I think, yeah, I want to embrace that more.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. I've got a few minutes left, so I think I might forego your audience questions. Just Seth, I'm going to let you respond to that if you want, but also I just want to, perhaps for all of you, because we've only got a couple of minutes, you reminded me, Rabab, of Rebecca Solnit quote, which I can't get right, but essentially about revolution starting in like the shadows and on the edges and then making its way in. And I really like that. It makes me feel like the hope on the outside is like it'll make its way into the centre and things will be different. So I just wanted to invite you all to think a little bit, or maybe if you've got any thoughts on like, in your little bit of radical space that you're occupying, is there a like hope in the cracks that you're like, it will get there eventually? Seth?
Yes. To try and respond to a little bit of both of those things at the same time. I'm not too sure about where things will get to, but I do understand about where the like what's going on in the cracks. And from a very practical perspective, just to speak to what Amara and Rabab were talking about, when we are put in these environments and when we are practices that have taken on a shape that allows us to continually work in a capacity that's accessible for people who are struggling, people who are kind of experiencing some of the most difficult challenges of the society that we're living through, we often don't get afforded those spaces where we can kind of care for ourselves or care for each other. We don't get, that work is not resourced, that work is not recognised, and that work is rarely ever included in anyone's project budgets. But what we do find when we kind of work in that capacity is that we meet super amazing people like who I'm joined with today, and I think from there we start to understand how we can create those mechanisms ourselves. And we as an organisation about 3 years ago started to think about how we could turn our tools inward, and how we could start to create moments where we as practitioners who are facing some of these really, really difficult moments could face each other and share and learn from one another and kind of care for one another, and how importantly we could resource that work, and how we could create demonstrations like Amara was talking about in Graph, that allow us to show the kind of the potential in that work, not as a kind of commodity, not as something that can be kind of flaunted, but something that can be recognized as essential. That pivot came from conversations with our kinfolk. And I think that's the only thing that's kept us afloat when we've been in those really precarious environments, because like you said, like there is something that's really like you feel very vulnerable, as well as you're kind of holding the vulnerability of the people that you're working to support. And then it's also just important, just like Amara said, like that work also is extremely difficult as well. Like it's not, that work isn't particularly sexy or lovely. Like that those programs that we developed, the residency program that we developed, which was called Nurturing Ecologies, was influenced by conversations we've had with Amara and with Imi Kaur, who runs Civic Square. That was the most nervous I've ever felt about a project in the whole time that I've been doing this, because it was super exposing, right? It's really exposing to face your peers, to face your kind of kinfolk, and to open up and to understand how we can support one another. Because I do believe that in doing that, we are trying to demonstrate how these relationships can be exuded into other spaces, and how we can start to rethink the way that we form like organizations, institutions, structures, whatever you want to call them. I don't know the names, but I feel like that's the beginning of it. I can't remember what your second question was, but I'm just going to go
pass you on.
I'll be brief because
Some hope in the cracks, Amara,
let me be similar. Thank you. I think the decentering of the self in relation to like the North Star is like the big thing, and I think about it's not just not so much about where we're going, but it's what's already happening. We live under a veil that is telling us that all of this work isn't possible, all of who we are isn't possible, and there's an abundance of brilliant things, brilliant people, brilliant work, deep interdependence across all of these things that is already happening. And I feel like time together, time with our peers, is just a reaffirmation of that. So hope isn't something that I'm waiting for, it's here every day because of the everyday.
Fabulous, thank you.
I was thinking about your accounting and the maths, and actually I think some of the spaces of joy or resistance, or actually how we speak to funders about the fact that the maths has to change. So the labour is the labour is the labour, right? It's all labour. So there's invisible labour, which we do because we're actually building relationships with people. It's not quite considered, the work or the cultural production, but like that's bullshit. Like that has to shift. So our entire understanding of labour, I think, is shifting. I think I get hope from that. And then the other thing is, I feel like when we connect, it's fast. Connection can happen like that. And when we bring people together and we're focused on the connectivity, it doesn't take long. Everyone just like, generally people, I don't want to make generalizations about this because there are all kinds of reasons why that's not straightforward for everyone. We get that. But the possibility of connection is really possible. And the possibility of vulnerability together is where our joy is. And I think I want to raise that vulnerability as a criteria for everything that we're doing with others.
Thank you, Rabab. Okay, fantastic contributions, all of you. Thank you so much. Again, we could go on for hours. But we're all going to go and send you off to do some art instead. So just a round of applause for our brilliant speakers, please.